The harbor smelled of salt and iron, the way only a working port could. It was the summer of 1942, and along the fog-draped coast of Maine, even the air seemed to hold its breath. The war had already crossed the ocean in whispers. Reports of German submarines stalking the Atlantic, oil tankers exploding just beyond the horizon. Yet in this small harbor, a boy named Thomas Stevens still believed the world was made of light, water, and curiosity. His father, Lieutenant Harold Stevens of the U.S. Coast Guard, worked night patrols, scanning the black surface for enemy shadows. Thomas, barely 14, waited for his father's return each dawn by the piers, clutching a dented flashlight as if it were a toy telescope aimed at mystery. He liked to play with the harbor lights, bouncing their reflections against the moored boats and floating buoys. Using a piece of cracked mirror he'd found near the lighthouse, he would catch the beam and flicker it toward the water, watching how the ripples broke the light into small trembling coins. Sometimes he tried to mark his father's patrol boat as it came home, pretending to send secret codes that only they could understand. It was harmless fun, the kind no one would notice amid the noise of engines and gulls. But one night, Thomas noticed something peculiar. When he moved the mirror just so, the reflection didn't make the ship brighter. It erased it. From the breakwater, the boat's dark outline seemed to dissolve into the shining path the light drew across the surface. He laughed, thinking it was an illusion of the tide. The next morning, he tried again with the lamps on shore, arranging them in uneven intervals, some higher, some low. When he looked from the rocks, the anchored vessels appeared to melt into the glittering bands of light that danced over the waves. His father found him crouched behind a crate, adjusting mirrors scavenged from wrecked vehicles. "What are you doing, son?" Harold asked, half amused, half exasperated. "Making the ships disappear," Thomas answered with a grin. The officer walked to the edge, looked out, and froze. The water shimmered like liquid metal. The ships half vanished in it. "Do that again," he whispered. That evening, the fog rolled in from the Atlantic like a pale curtain, and for a few breathless minutes, the entire harbor seemed to vanish. The ships were still there, but not to the eye. Harold said nothing. He merely placed a hand on his son's shoulder, staring at the invisible silhouettes beyond the pier. Somewhere offshore, a German submarine prowled, searching for outlines against the coast. But that night, under the quiet flicker of a boy's mirror, the harbor hid its heartbeat. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there tonight? By the spring of 1942, the Atlantic no longer felt like a barrier, but a battlefield. German U-boats prowled the American coastline as if it were their hunting ground. From Newfoundland to Florida, the ocean turned into a graveyard of steel. In the first 6 months alone, more than 400 ships were sunk, many within sight of the shore. Tankers burned on the horizon, painting the night sky orange. Beaches glistened with oil slicks and shattered crates stamped property of the United States Navy. The war, once distant, had arrived with a cold, mechanical hum beneath the waves. Every port on the East Coast lived in dread. In towns like Cape May, Norfolk, and Charleston, people drew their curtains tight at night. City skylines dimmed as blackout orders went into effect. Even amusement parks and boardwalks went dark. The Coast Guard patrolled with muffled engines, afraid that a single glint of light could reveal a convoy's outline to the periscope of a lurking U-boat. Sailors whispered that the ocean itself seemed haunted, too calm, too silent, before a torpedo's flash tore it open. In the harbors, the stakes became unbearable. Supply convoys bound for Britain carried not just fuel and ammunition, but hope. The lifeline of an entire continent under siege. Every ship lost was more than cargo. It was a link in the fragile chain keeping the Allies alive. Admiral Ernest King demanded new methods of concealment, furious that German submarines could track ships merely by the reflection of lights along the coast. "Darken the cities," he said, "and hide the ships." But hiding thousands of tons of steel on open water seemed impossible. On shore, the Coast Guard improvised. Fishermen were enlisted to report strange wakes at night. Volunteers painted rooftops black. Young women in the Civil Air Patrol scouted the beaches for submarine silhouettes, yet even with radar experiments underway, the enemy still struck close, too close. In January, the SS Alan Jackson, an American oil tanker, was sunk just 60 miles off Cape Hatteras. One survivor wrote in his log, "We saw the lighthouse blinking on shore while we swam in burning oil." In this climate of fear, any trick, any illusion, any fragment of ingenuity that could make a ship invisible was worth more than gold. The Navy tested camouflage paint, smoke screens, and deceptive lighting. But what no one imagined, not even the engineers in Boston or the strategists in Washington, was that the seed of a solution would come from a 14-year-old boy on the docks of Maine, playing with mirrors as the world burned beyond the horizon. The question hanging in every officer's mind was painfully simple: how do you hide a fleet in plain sight? The morning fog rolled into Portland Harbor like a living thing, swallowing the horizon. Thomas Stevens sat on a wooden piling, clutching the same cracked mirror that had fascinated him for weeks. The air was heavy with salt and diesel fumes. Tugboats groaned somewhere beyond the mist, their horns echoing across the bay. It was here, amid that strange stillness, that discovery arrived. Not through planning or training, but through the idle experiment of a curious child. Thomas aimed the mirror toward the lighthouse and watched the reflected light scatter over the surface. The harbor seemed to shimmer like quicksilver. From where he sat, the row of docked patrol boats looked blurred, their outlines dissolving into the haze. But when he moved a few steps to the left, the entire pier seemed to vanish. The reflection of the water had merged perfectly with the fog's glow. It was as if the harbor had folded itself into the sea. Just then, footsteps approached. Lieutenant Harold Stevens, weary from a long night shift, paused behind his son. He followed the mirror's glint with narrowed eyes. "You're going to blind someone with that thing," he muttered, but then fell silent. From the viewing angle near the breakwater, the ships were gone. Only the mirrored shimmer remained, masking their shapes. The lieutenant crouched beside his son, studying the alignment of light, water, and fog. "Do that again," he said quietly. What Thomas had stumbled upon was something naval engineers had only begun to theorize: a primitive form of counter-illumination. By reflecting and diffusing light against a foggy backdrop, the target's silhouette merged with its surroundings. The brighter water surface canceled out the darker hulls. In scientific terms, it was camouflage by optical interference. In the language of war, it meant survival. That evening, Harold invited 2 Coast Guard officers to observe. They arrived skeptical, expecting a child's trick. But when Thomas recreated the effect, the men stood speechless. Commander Russell Blake finally muttered, "From a mile out, no U-boat periscope would spot this." Within days, small-scale tests began using flash lamps and mirrors along the pier. The boy was not allowed to attend, yet from his window, he watched the experiments light up the fog like a quiet symphony. Beams bouncing, fading, blending, until the harbor itself seemed to breathe. In his diary, Harold wrote one line that would later resurface in declassified files. "The boy sees what we overlook, the ocean's own disguise." They called it the harbor trick, though among the Coast Guard engineers it was spoken of in tones of disbelief. It began as an experiment, a small idea born from a child's mirror, and soon became a technique that turned the coastline itself into a weapon of illusion. The first trial took place in July 1942, under heavy fog at the Portsmouth Naval Yard. Engineers arranged lamps along the dock, mounted at specific angles, and used sheets of polished aluminum as reflectors. The goal was to flood the water with diffused light, just enough to erase the dark silhouettes of cargo ships preparing to sail. The science behind it was delicate, almost poetic. By controlling the direction and intensity of light, they could make the surface of the harbor shine brighter than the ships upon it. To a distant observer, or a German periscope eyeing the coast through mist, the bright reflection flattened depth and contrast. The human eye, stripped of shadows, could no longer tell where the sea ended and the hull began. It was camouflage by inversion, light used not to reveal but to erase. Reports from the first test astonished the command. Commander Russell Blake wrote, "When seen from 1,000 yards through field glass, the harbor appeared empty, yet 3 tankers were docked in plain view." Encouraged, the Navy authorized further trials, incorporating sodium lamps, portable mirrors, and even smoke screens made from diesel vapor. Civilian scientists from MIT's radiation laboratory were quietly brought in, adding their knowledge of radar and optics. The blend of folk intuition and high technology created something neither side of the war had seen before: a living mirage built by human hands. Soon, the system grew more elaborate. Reflective panels were installed on buoys, and adjustable lenses were attached to harbor lights. When timed correctly, these created a shifting wall of silver glare across the water, making entire convoys invisible during departure. Fishermen in Maine and Massachusetts were instructed to synchronize their lanterns with the Coast Guard's light patterns. Even the natural fog became part of the design, a willing accomplice. Not every trial worked. Sometimes the glare backfired, revealing ships instead of hiding them. But through endless nights of adjustment, they learned the subtle balance between brightness and concealment. The boys' mirror trick evolved into a coded choreography of light. Each harbor had its rhythm, its pulse. To the untrained eye, it was chaos. To those who knew, it was an invisible shield. By autumn 1942, naval reports noted a 17% decrease in convoy losses along the northeastern corridor. It was impossible to prove the harbor trick alone was responsible, yet commanders called it the quietest miracle on water. What began as a child's curiosity had grown into one of the most unusual forms of deception in modern warfare, a defense not of armor or gunfire, but of brilliance, reflection, and faith in the unseen. The night chosen for the first real test of the harbor trick was moonless, the air thick with mist rolling off the Atlantic. On October 23, 1942, 27 tankers and cargo ships lined the docks at Norfolk, Virginia, waiting to form a convoy bound for Liverpool under the code name HX-212. Each vessel carried thousands of barrels of oil, food, and ammunition, enough to fuel not only vehicles and planes, but the morale of an entire front. They were the veins of the Allied body, and the ocean was its bloodstream. Losing even one meant lifeblood spilled into black water. Lieutenant Harold Stevens stood on the control tower balcony, glancing at the clock, 02:11. Across the harbor, the light arrays flickered on. The reflections shimmered across the surface, bending and dancing like phantom rivers. A system of mirrored buoys refracted the light back toward the sea, merging ship outlines into a seamless glow. To any observer offshore, it looked like nothing more than a restless sheet of silver fog. Even from the nearby cliffs, the massive vessels seemed to dissolve into the water itself. At 02:30, the convoy began to move. Engines low, radios silent. The harbor trick held. Not a single outline betrayed its presence. But 20 miles east, in the deep Atlantic, U-boat U-553 patrolled the shipping lanes. Its commander, Kapitän Lieutenant Karl Thurman, detected faint radar echoes that hinted at large vessels nearby. Yet through his periscope, he saw only haze. The horizon shimmered, a trick of light that made distance and shape impossible to judge. After 2 hours of pursuit, he ordered, "Kein Ziel sichtbar," no visible target, and turned north. On shore, unaware of how narrowly they had escaped, Harold exhaled. "The boy's light worked," he murmured to Commander Blake. Blake only nodded, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. Dozens of lives, perhaps hundreds, had been spared by something born not of weapons or mathematics, but of observation. The kind that notices how light moves across fog. Later reports would confirm the convoy reached Halifax safely, with all ships intact. No one mentioned mirrors, lamps, or children in the official summary, but among the crew, rumors spread. A ghost convoy, invisible to the enemy, protected by the sea itself. Some called it superstition, others called it providence. In a letter to his mother, a young sailor from the SS Cardonia wrote, "We sailed under nothing but the color of the fog. I never saw the lights of home fade because they never appeared. It felt like sailing inside a dream." And somewhere in Maine, Thomas Stevens watched the harbor that night, unaware that his childish fascination had reached across hundreds of miles to guide a fleet safely through the darkness. When the war ended in 1945, the harbor lights returned to their ordinary glow. Cities lit up again, beaches reopened, and the memory of blackouts faded like smoke. Yet within the archives of the U.S. Navy, a thin folder stamped "Classified" carried the story of how a mirror and a fog had once hidden an entire convoy. It was filed under optical deception, non-standard methods, and would remain sealed for more than 2 decades. Lieutenant Harold Stevens retired quietly and rarely spoke about the project. The boy, Thomas, grew into a man, joined the Navy himself, and served as a radar technician in the Korean War. Only after his father's death did he find a weathered journal wrapped in oilcloth, the old wartime diary. Inside, a single entry stood out in fading ink. "If light can erase, it can also protect." In 1969, a small article appeared in a naval engineering magazine. It referenced a civilian-inspired reflection technique used along the eastern seaboard during 1942 to 43. Credited vaguely to field officers of the Coast Guard. No names, no photographs, just the admission that the method had reduced optical detection by up to 40%. That fragment was enough to stir curiosity among historians decades later, leading to the eventual declassification of the harbor trick in 1987. Within the released documents were photographs, blurred and grainy, showing the experimental light grids across Portsmouth and Norfolk. In the corner of one image, a handwritten note read, "Test Concept T, Stevens Observation. Maintain reflected brightness on fog layer." Historians debated whether T. Stevens was a naval engineer or perhaps the boy's father. Only when Thomas, then an old man living in Portland, was interviewed did he smile and say softly, "That was me. Or rather, that was my mistake." He had kept his childhood mirror all those years, the glass now cloudy with salt and age. When asked what he thought of his role, he answered, "I only played with light. The sea did the rest." His words carried the humility of those who never meant to change history, yet somehow did. But among the declassified testimonies lay something even more striking. The diary of a German radio operator captured in 1943 off the Massachusetts coast. It read, "They won't let us see them. The Americans have learned to erase the sea. They do not fight only with steel, but with light and silence." And so, 2 diaries, one from a boy, one from a prisoner, unknowingly spoke to each other across decades. Both describe the same wonder, that in war, the smallest act of observation can become the greatest act of protection. Would you have believed that a child's mirror could outwit a submarine fleet? Share your thoughts below. How many of history's miracles do you think began as accidents? By the late 1950s, the war had settled into memory. Shipyards, once filled with sirens, and convoys now echoed only with gulls. The rusted docks of Portland stood quiet, the tide whispering where once the harbor trick had painted its curtain of light. Thomas Stevens, now in his 30s, returned often to that same shoreline where he had played as a boy. He would sit with a cup of coffee, watching how the sun scattered across the ripples, the same shimmer that once made ships vanish. To everyone else, it was just light on water. To him, it was something sacred. A reminder that imagination, when guided by necessity, could bend the rules of survival. He remembered the day the Navy finally told him, in formal letters and stamped seals, that the method developed from his discovery had saved no fewer than 250,000 tons of cargo from destruction. The number was staggering, though he barely reacted. "It wasn't mine," he told a friend years later. "It belonged to the sea." The Navy never publicized his name, nor did he ever request recognition. What mattered was that the principle endured. In the Cold War years, engineers refined the same counter-illumination ideas for new ships, submarines, even aircraft. Light became a weapon again, not through brightness, but through disappearance. The reflection of one boy's mirror had turned into an entire branch of optical warfare. One evening in 1961, Thomas met an old German sailor at a maritime museum in Boston. The man, once part of a U-boat crew, recognized the story from fragments whispered among veterans. "We thought it was sorcery," he said, smiling faintly. "The water burned like silver, and your ships melted into it. We fired at ghosts." They shared a quiet moment of laughter. Two men once divided by the ocean, now united by memory and the calm sound of waves. That night, Thomas walked back to the pier. The fog returned as if summoned by time itself. He lifted the old mirror from his coat pocket, the edges chipped, the surface dull. Tilting it toward the bay, he caught the faint glimmer of the lighthouse beam and reflected it onto the mist. The glow trembled, then vanished. The same trick, the same illusion, but now only for him. The harbor lay still, the light flickering softly against the dark. In that silence, one truth lingered. Even in a war built on machinery and destruction, salvation had come from something as fragile as reflection. The sea had been both enemy and ally, and a boy's curiosity had turned its surface into a shield. As he lowered the mirror, the fog swallowed the last spark of light, leaving only the quiet heartbeat of the tide. History often remembers great wars through the thunder of cannons and the signatures on treaties. Yet the most extraordinary victories hide in the quiet corners, in the minds that see differently. The story of the harbor trick is not about heroism in the usual sense. It is about perception, about how a single observation can change the geometry of danger. A boy, watching the shimmer of a harbor, unknowingly touched the boundary between art and survival. His mirror became a window through which war itself could be deflected. In the broader arc of history, such moments remind us that human progress does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers in the rhythm of light and fog. The child's imagination, the father's belief, the engineer's curiosity, the enemy's confusion, all were bound together by the same fragile element: reflection. The sea, indifferent and eternal, merely lent them its surface. Thomas Stevens grew old near the same water where his idea was born. On quiet mornings, locals said they could still see him walking the docks, tracing light across the tide with a small piece of mirror. Perhaps he was chasing memory. Perhaps he was measuring silence. Either way, the story endures. Proof that even in the darkest war, there are still sparks of wonder waiting to be found by those who dare to look differently.